Good afternoon. Today I will speak about Edgar Allan Poe. I usually dedicate two full classes to this author who was the greatest American romantic writer of the age. I have already mentioned Poe with regards to both Longfellow and Irving, and if you remember, Poe at first admired them, and then as his popularity grew, he started criticizing Longfellow and Irving in his own reviews. This is why whenever I come across this fabulous quote by North Fry, I think of Poe. Let me just read it. There is no reason why a great poet should be a wise and good man, or even a tolerable human being, but there is every reason why his reader should be improved in his humanity as a result of reading him. I think this is so true of Poe. He was not at all a likable character, and he had a nightmarish life. But with his writings, he influenced much of the literature of the 20th century and, of course, the more contemporary literature that we can read today. Let's see some of his achievements. I mentioned that he was the greatest American romantic who exerted a heavy influence on the French symbolists. Then he was the originator of both the detective and the science fiction genre, and today he is most famous for his poetry, his poems including The Raven, and his short tales, which are full of the macabre, and the main tone in his tales is that horror and terror, with which his own life was also full. I singled out one line from one of his poems to describe the whole of Poe's life. It goes like this: all that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream. I think this line perfectly summarizes what Poe was into. He was a prophet of his age because he started to deal with the inner life of a person, saying that what we can see on the surface is just the tip of an iceberg. This is an idea that was later developed, you probably know, by Freud and later by Ernest Hemingway, that we are all icebergs, that 7/8 of our personalities are beneath the water. And this is what Poe wanted to explore, was beneath that water that he called life. In that, he was the first, but he was not popular at the time precisely because of these ideas. His obsession with our dreams and our secret inner lives is clearly seen in some of the titles of his poems. A Dream Within a Dream, Dreamland, The Sleeper, his favorite poem, A Dream, Dreams. So these are just variations on the same topic. In one of these, he says, "Oh, that my young life were a lasting dream." So his childhood here is not described as favorable. So let me tell you something about that. Poe lost both his parents, who were professional actors, at the age of 3, and he was separated from his brother and sister to be adopted by John and Frances Allan. However, he was never legally adopted. They did view him as an adoptive son, and they provided him with excellent education. He even stayed in England for 5 years, educating himself further, but he was never to receive their wealth because the Allans were a very wealthy family. One reason was that when he was an adolescent, he started drinking and gambling, and this was not so good for his adoptive father, John Allan, with whom Poe frequently quarreled. Because of one of his quarrels, Poe decided to enlist in the U.S. Army in 1827. But there, on ship, he continued drinking and gambling, and he was discharged after 2 years. In the meantime, he publishes his first collection, Tamerlane and Other Poems, which was not at all successful, but he did not give up, and he published other of Tamerlane and Minor Poems 2 years later, and finally got some favorable notice. Next, he moved to Baltimore to live with his aunt, Maria Clem, and her 7-year-old daughter, Virginia, with whom Poe is going to become obsessed. So obsessed, in fact, that when she turns 13, he would marry her. And you already see that this semi-incestuous relationship with his niece, who was just a little girl when he married her, was bound to bring him some negative criticism as well. He continued writing, publishing poems by Edgar Allan Poe, again a bit success for him there. And then in 1833, he won his first prize of $50 for a short story called MS Found in a Bottle. This story is a satire on classical sea adventure tales in which the unnamed narrator is describing, actually writing down everything that goes on that ship, which is in the middle of a shipwreck. There is a great storm, and at the same time, the narrator is trying to record everything that's going on, only to throw the bottle with the manuscript in the sea a second before they all drown. So MS is short for manuscript, not message. In order to show you just a glimpse of Poe's excellent style, I singled out one excerpt from a manuscript in the bottle, so let me just read it. The crew paced the deck with unquiet and tremulous step, but there is upon their countenances an expression more of the eagerness of hope than the apathy of despair. In the meantime, the wind is still in our poop, and as we carry a crowd of canvas, the ship is at times lifted bodily from out the sea. Oh, horror upon horror! Now here you can see this exclamation, the specific style of Poe in which he always writes in the first person narration. His narrators never have a name. This is one of his characteristics, and he has these exclamations of terror and horror and macabre in all his stories. Let me continue. The eyes open suddenly to the right and to the left, and we are whirling dizzily in immense concentric circles, round and round the borders of a gigantic amphitheater, the summit of whose walls is lost in the darkness and the distance. So basically they were stuck in this amphitheater. But little time will be left to me to ponder upon my destiny. The circles rapidly grow small. We are plunging madly within the grasp of the whirlpool, and amid a roaring and bellowing and thundering motion of tempest, the ship is quivering, oh God, and going down. So you can see in the last sentence that the last words were written as he was drowning, and this is somewhat ridiculous, I have to say. It reminds me of the novel Pamela, if you remember, by Samuel Richardson, in which Pamela literally writes down things as they happen, as she's being assaulted by that main character and so on. Although it is somewhat ridiculous, as I say, the style is there. So these are the beginnings of his mastery with words, of which we will speak later on. So as I said, he continued drinking, losing his jobs, and because he was such a failure and he was being rejected all the time, he continued living in a constant state of panic. Panic about losing his job, about not having money, not having food literally to eat. And this was a good thing for him because it inspired all his horror stories. He managed, however, to write his novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket in 1838. It was not at all successful again, and this is the only complete novel that we have by Edgar Allan Poe. It is another sea adventure in which Arthur Gordon Pym, who is the eponymous hero, goes on a series of adventures. There are many mishaps, there is even cannibalism. It's interesting, but not that successful for Poe. And he moved to Philadelphia to become the co-editor of Britain's Gentleman's Magazine, even though this magazine actually published a very negative review of Arthur Gordon Pym. Just a fun fact. And it is here that he published some of his famous stories, including The Fall of the House of Usher. But he had to give up his job because he got into a quarrel with the owner of the paper, of course. Later he moved to Graham's magazine, and let's see what they have to say about this. It was becoming clear that 2 years was about as long as Poe could hold a job, and his stay at Graham's confirmed this principle. Though he contributed skillfully wrought fiction and unquestionably developed as a critic, his endless literary feuding, his alcoholism, and his inability to get along very well with people caused him to leave after 1842. So this is another magazine that he had to leave because of his misbehavior. Next, in 1843, he won another prize of $100, and this is the greatest sum that Poe had ever earned, for any of his stories. The story is The Golden Bug, and this story is considered to be the precursor precursor of the modern detective genre because it contains cryptograms and secret writing. In the story, the main character, William Legrand, gets bitten by a gold bug, and then he has these hallucinations and he behaves strangely. He also discovers a piece of parchment on which there is some writing written with invisible ink. So this is a cryptogram that they have to solve. And with the unnamed narrator and his servant, William Legrand goes on to find a treasure which is buried based on the directions on that parchment. The story itself contains all of this, including the map, the parchment, the code, how you should solve the riddle, and so on. So let me just show you one example of this. Here it is, the part of the cryptogram. It says, "Here Legrand submitted the parchment to my inspection." Again, the unnamed narrator is speaking. The following characters were rudely traced between the death's head and the goat. So now we have a series of numbers and symbols, as you can see, and next we have the way to solve this riddle, because each number and each symbol corresponds to one letter, so that we can solve the riddle ourselves, or we can just continue to read and listen to the solution given by Poe. I think it's a very interesting story and definitely something to lead us into what's true detective fiction. But in spite of all this, it's not the gold bug that's considered to be the first detective story ever. It's the murders in the Rue Morgue. Why is this? Well, because here we have the hero who acts as a detective. His name is Gilles Dupin. I believe I mentioned him when we did Sherlock Holmes, because Arthur Conan Doyle was inspired by Poe, and Sherlock Holmes is modeled on Dupin. Dupin appears in two more stories, The Mystery of Marie Urgette and The Purloined Letter. Purloined means stolen letter, but of these three, I guess The Murders in the Rue Morgue is the most popular. The word detective did not exist at the time this story was published. Basically, in 1846, the first police force was founded in America, in Boston, and they did have detective policemen, but here the word detective is an adjective, and later on it was just abbreviated to become just a detective as a noun, and it came from to detect, to find out something. Why is this the first modern detective story? Because it introduces us to the method that Dupin uses here. So Dupin is not a professional detective because there were no detectives at the time. He just wanted to help the police out of his own curiosity. The method that I mentioned is called ratiocination. How do you solve a crime? I think all the modern TV shows, criminal TV shows, I hope you're fans as I am, especially of the Scandinavian noir, deal with this. You have to identify with the mind of the killer or the thief or any criminal in order to see how they would behave in a certain situation. This is the way to solve the crime. Arthur Conan Doyle basically took this method from Poe and he developed it into his own character of Sherlock Holmes. He said that Doyle plagiarized everything that was valuable about Poe and his detective stories. And this is what Holmes says. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. So this is actually Poe's motto, only a bit adapted to fit Sherlock Holmes and his extreme personality. So today we can say that Poe was the greater writer of the two, but Arthur Conan Doyle's detective fiction certainly surpasses that of Poe. Poe's short stories that I find very valuable are those horror stories that I have been mentioning throughout this video, whereas his detective stories are not as good as Doyle's. So for example, in The Murders of the Rue Morgue, the killer is not a person, but believe it or not,